Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. I'm back with Zander Cannon, and we are recapping all of Kaijumax.
Oh wow.
And by recapping all of it, I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna go issue for issue, page for page, because we'll be here forever.
Good. I would never even remember what happened. It's all gone now.
Xander, for anybody who's not aware of what Kaijumax is, how would you like to give a quick description of what it is?
I mean, the stuff that I always said to people is that it's Godzilla goes to Oz, the prison, not the fairyland, and they all form gangs and do drugs and kill each other. And usually that sort of sorts out between like readers, like that you can kind of the parents with 8-year-olds go, oh, all right, I'll move on, and all the people who are like, oh, I love prison drama and this sounds weird are kind of dialed in. So it was a useful phrase.
Can you tell me about the fact that structurally speaking, plot wise, it is a prison drama. And then
Sure.
on top of it is all of the kaiju and monsters and Super Sentai stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I always talked about it sort of being like like it's a serious prison drama with like an inch of kaiju paint on top of it. Like that everything that happens is really stuff that's pulled from prison dramas, but it's also, I mean, also tried to make sure that there was an element of like the kaiju plots, like that, but that every plot element would kind of have a little bit of both. But really, it was like I didn't want it to be I didn't want it to be kooky in its story. I wanted to be serious, but then be made absurd by the fact that it's giant monsters, you know, so that you would go like, oh, I'm completely invested in this serious story, but I'm laughing because it's like a goofy looking monster that exploded or whatever. And I'm sad he's dead, but oh, it's a lot of blood and guts. That's weird, like I wanted to have this dissonance constantly.
How did you come up with the idea?
Boy, I mean, so I was not intending to draw it originally. I intended it to be sort of a
Yeah.
side project because, and this was in probably 2008 or 9 or 10,
Yeah.
something like that. Like it was a long time ago. And there was sort of a sense of absurdist sort of mashups in comics. And I just kind of thought, oh, this would be a fun side project as like I'd always kind of want to do something with kaiju, but then I didn't really know what. Like I wanted to do like what do they do when they're not doing what they do in the movies? And I thought, oh well, will they have a bar? Will they have what's Monster Island like? And I thought, oh, what if Monster Island were a prison? And because I always really liked the prison drama as a sort of shades of gray type of drama. There was no good guys, no bad guys. Everybody's just sort of in a situation. And and I think once you kind of hit on that, you're like, oh yeah, that would be great. And you think of all the gags, you're like, oh haha, the weight room, they're gonna be lifting buildings, and the you know, if they're dealing drugs, it's gonna be like smog, like from the smog monster, and like there'd be, you know, they want like nuclear waste as heroin or whatever, like that kind of stuff. Like all the jokes, when you think of a good concept, all the jokes kind of jump to mind immediately. And of course, I told some people and they were like, yeah, that's going to be great. Like, that's going to be really cool. And I think a lot of people thought of it as being like, oh, this is going to be jokes, like just jokes, you know.
No.
Right. And I mean, and it is jokes, but they're very, but built around a sad story. I mean, everything, I always thought of everything as being a gag with a punchline. But it wasn't always funny. It was usually pretty grim,
Yeah.
but that there was and that stories for you. Like you set it up and you pay it off, and the emotion that you get is not irrelevant. It could be varied. It's maybe you laugh, maybe you go, oh, and maybe you go like, oh, that's sad, or whatever. So yeah, that it really was. I mean, it wasn't sort of mercenary, like, oh, I'm going to make $1 million doing this, because that definitely didn't happen. But like, but it was something where it was a little bit mechanical, the process, like it wasn't just sort of like, oh, this is a thing that I want to do. It was like, I want to do monsters, but then like, think, let's really think sort of logically about how this can be constructed. You know what I mean?
You were the artist originally attached to this was Ryan Brown,
Yeah.
and he'd drawn a few pages.
Yeah.
What
Well,
happened?
I mean,
Yeah.
Right. That was all sort of like the, you know, happenstance. Ryan and I were having a great time figuring this out, and I was going to letter it, and he was gonna draw it. I think he was, I can't remember if he was drawing it digitally or on paper. I think he was drawing it on paper, but I was lettering it digitally. I mean, it was really kind of a fun process back and forth. But that was right at the time that his Kickstarter launched for God Hates Astronauts, and then Image said, "You want to do God Hates Astronauts series?" And so, I mean, his star was rising, and then he's done Curse Words, and he's done 8 Billion Genies, all this stuff. Like he was our trajectories only intersected for a very short period of time, and so, um, uh, yeah, and when he couldn't do it, I was like, well, no big deal. That was just it was one of 1,000 pitches that I'd sort of kicked out there. But then Charlie Chu at Oni was like, "Well, do you want to draw it?" I remember thinking, like, without hesitation, I was like, "No," not because I didn't want to draw it. I hadn't really even thought about my art style in regards to it, because it was meant to be Ryan's art style. It was meant to play to his strengths, and so. But then but it's like the idea of doing all of everything, and I
Yeah.
mean, of course, there was scope creep for sure. Like, I could have just said, oh, I'll just pencil it, someone else ink, letter, color. But I mean, you got to pay all those people. And I knew that this was not going to be something that's going to make enough money to support that. And so I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to ink, letter, color. And once I sort of start to realize, oh, I can do this digitally, like that, which the last time I'd really kind of considered that sort of stuff, it had not been it was not a possibility. I didn't have the equipment. But once I sort of figured out, oh, I can do it digitally, and I can probably do a 22-page comic in 5 to 6 weeks, something like that. Then all of a sudden it started making a little bit more sense. And it's like, okay, well then, and then we can get a page rate that would never support several people, but maybe one person who's working their butt off and owns it, it'll make it a little bit more sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, when that was an eye-opening for me, like, wow, that's really great. Like, I like writing and drawing things. It just was never logistically feasible to my mind.
How do you think your approach to the whole concept changed after, you took on the art duties?
um, well, the way it was written, I mean, the first issue was written and the first season was pretty well planned out. But and so once I started drawing it, I mean, I think that there was a lot of stuff. I think that the tone just changed a little bit. Like, there's just a little bit of like adjustment to the tone, because one, I now was drawing like stuff that looked like cartoon characters. I mean, they would look, everything's cartoon characters, obviously, but I mean, they were cartoony cartoon characters, and and they and so there was that, yeah, like the dissonance that I talked about. And so one, I think that allowed me to go darker on the story stuff because it was lightening it up with all the art. But also I think that, like, having complete control and seeing that loop, sort of the feedback loop of like, oh, I wrote this thing, now I drew it, and now I see what it is. I'm like, ooh, maybe I better dial that back a little bit. Or, like, there was a lot of tropes that were kind of cruel and I don't
Yeah.
know, transgressive for the point of being transgressive. You know what I mean? So that's part of prison media. That's I don't necessarily disavow it, but I also just am like, oh, like, yeah, that that might have stepped a little bit over that line. That might have stepped a little bit over that line, and then and it's just, I think that as I worked on it, I thought, like, okay, this is what this is. This is the center of what this is, and in terms of art, in terms of writing, in terms of tone, in terms of color, everything.
Who do you feel is there's an ensemble cast to the series. Who do you feel is the main character? Do you feel that there is a main character?
I mean, people say that there's not. I think Electricorp is I mean, he's a central character, and he was reverse engineered as a central character. Like some series are like kind of extrapolated out from their main character, like Batman. You're like, okay, here's a man who dresses like a bat. Well, what's the city that he lives in? Like, okay, it's Gotham City. And what are his villains like? Okay, they're whatever, people in animal masks. Uh, or there's something like Star Wars, where it's like, here's the world and the ships and the Empire and all this sort of stuff, and like, well, who would be the person who would like take it down? Okay, well, a farm boy or whatever. Like, they kind of interpolate the main character. And Kaijumax is that way too, where it's like, okay, here's the main character is the island, I guess. I mean, I don't I think that's a little bit silly to say, but the main character is the island, and then you kind of interpolate, well, who's going to be, the weak character who has to sort of figure their way out? Who's going to be the strong character who doesn't know anything about the place? Who's going to be the, conniving character? Who's going to be the whatever? And so Electrogore is sort of the person who's like, okay, well, who's the person who needs to learn everything so we can follow him around and learn the rules, and then also has some relatable stuff. Always got kids, he committed sort of like a victimless crime, that kind of stuff, so that you can kind of get on his side pretty early.
Jean Valjean.
Yeah, Jean Valjean. I mean, uh, and so yeah, I think that was. I mean, he's the main character because I created him to be the main character, and I think that I like that I had the leeway, and there's no like toy people in my ear saying like, well, you have to make him the main character for every book. It's like I could just sort of say like, okay, well, he's now in the background doing his thing. I don't have to pile misery upon him now. I already did, and so I can pile misery on this character or whatever. And so I think that was really nice to be able to sort of like veer away. And I think that it came back so that he had a momentous final season, and that was consequential, and it felt like I hopefully it felt like sort of the final part of the arc for him, that he could that he could resolve his arc, and in a way the whole series could resolve its arc in that
I
same way.
I think it is a case where he's the main character, not in the sense that he drives the story, but more in the
Right.
sense that he's the thematic heart of the story.
Well, and I also wanted to say, I mean, this is an episodic thing as much as it has an overall arc. Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I would want to do because it's exhausting. But I mean, if Kaijumax were this unstoppable sort of juggernaut of media, yeah, there could be another 6, 10, 100 seasons of it, and somebody else could do it. And I feel like it could really, I mean, it would run the risk of like retreading the same ground. But I mean, I think that you could take out the whole cast and put in a whole new cast and just tell more of the story. Like that, there's one person doesn't really drive the story because by design, everything nobody has all that much agency in this prison because they're being told what to do and where to go and where to be at all times. So, um, and I like that. I like that sort of, in a way, that kind of reactive. Like, oh well, this has been done to me. Now I have to do this back, and these sort of escalating stakes, um, where it's different than something like, an adventure story where somebody's actively going out into the world and sort of charting their own course.
Yeah, can you tell me about, developing these characters and kind of seeing how the dynamics were going to play out? Like, did you come up with them for the sake of the story? Did you know you wanted these kinds of characters beforehand, and then a story came out of it, or what?
you know, I wouldn't say this. I wouldn't say there's no exception to this, but generally speaking, all the characters were created to make uh, to sort of fill a hole or in the story. Like, oh, I need somebody to sort of observe this part. I need somebody to sort of like uh, be a go-between in these from these characters. I need somebody to be funny. I need somebody to be tragic. I need somebody to, and so, and of course, I was also thinking visually. I was thinking like, oh well, I want a character who looks like this Ultraman monster or Hedera or like Rodan or whatever. Like all
Rita
just the
Repulsa.
right Rita Repulsa, all the gags, all the sort of the visual gags. Um, and so, but I mean, again, it's like I wanted everything to sort of play its part in terms of like kaiju media and in terms of prison media. So we could have like a Voltron character, like the Five Lion Voltron
Yeah.
character, but also sort of like have that be somebody who takes everybody's viewpoint into account, and it becomes overwhelming for her. That kind of thing. Like, oh well, everybody has to have a vote because we're a 5 robot machine, and all of a sudden, it causes all these problems. So, uh, you know, I I think that there are probably characters in there that I was like, oh, I designed years ago, and what was actually even more likely is that I drew them in the background to kind of be like, oh, kind of like a monster that I kind of like from Ultraman. And then I'm like, ooh, I like that character. I'm gonna give him a name, and uh, kind of like seeing an extra in the background, be like, I like your look. Come on up here and let's give you a SAG card or whatever. Uh, but yeah, yeah, it seems a little bit, it sounds a little bit cold and mercenary, but I really like having characters that first like first sort of like serve their purpose in the plot, and then I work backwards and give them a character personality.
I've told you before that I think your art style is kind of like a Trojan horse in that it makes people think that it's going to be a purely humorous, maybe for kids book.
Oh yeah, all the kids that I have to be like, I'm so sorry, please don't read this, or to your parents, please don't let them read this. Yeah, I even had to. It was I was at Paris Comic Con, and there was this woman from Italy who was trying to get it for her son, and I don't speak Italian. She didn't speak English or French, so that the publisher, and so we settled on Spanish, and so in my sort of like barely acceptable Spanish, I had to tell her, no, like there's drugs and there's gangs and there's violence that's not for kids. And she just looked at me like I was crazy. Like, yeah. And I mean, yeah, like I've left so much money on the table, metaphorically speaking, by by having this book be absolutely not for the people who think that it's for them. So
So many children you could trick into reading it.
I
Uh,
know it'd be great. It'd be great if I had fewer scruples. I suppose it would be great. So
which brings me to the moment in an early issue. See, this is what happens when you binge read all of these things. Like you don't know which issue is which. So
yeah,
so it's an early issue where Zon first is incarcerated in Kaijumax, and the first time he meets Electrogore, and he straight up assaults him. And you
yeah.
mention in this edition of the book that this is in fact you mentioned this edition of the book because it has annotations that that's the moment that was a turning point for your fandom.
Oh yeah, well, yeah, turning away point for a lot of people. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I get a lot of questions about that, and I sort of feel like I stand by it. It's I felt like if it was followed through with, yeah, I mean, it's so tropey, right? It's the central trope of prison drama. It's everything sort of radiates out from like the threat of sexual violence, and I think that uh, it would, I mean, any media, any sort of conception of this idea would have to sort of contend with it in some way or another. I probably blundered into it without thinking about it enough. But once I drew it, and that was another thing, like because I was drawing it, I had this feedback loop and go, ooh, that's too much. I can't treat this with lightly, and so within the confines of what I've created, I have to sort of like come out of it with some sensitivity and with some sort of thoughtfulness without undoing drama of it and stuff. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, certainly that was the off ramp for a ton of people, and why wouldn't it be? Like it's too grim for one version of what people expected this to be. I had always kind of uh, thought of it as being PG-13 in terms of what it shows, but that's a step too far for a lot of people, and I don't begrudge them that at all.
If Alan Moore had written it, people would be okay with
I don't know. I mean, I think that there's been a reassessment of a lot of that, of a lot of his grimmest stuff too. Uh,
That's probably a bad
yeah,
line. I should probably cut that out. So
yeah. I mean, well, I
yeah.
also think that being the greatest writer of comics ever gives you a little bit of leeway with people. Uh, you know.
I did so I think one of the fascinating things about your art style is that you can keep things a little vague because you don't draw realistically. So I think I'm thinking of Kang, and you say that like the thing in front of him is either feathers or crystals. And do you know what they are?
Oh, I think they're feathers. I think I've drawn one that like came off, and I drew like a regular feather.
Okay.
but but yeah, I mean, yeah, so much of the stuff that I draw, it's just shapes. Like it's like, oh, I like triangles and how they interact with, sort of like cylinders and spheres. And I don't know what any of those things are, like because you just kind of design things and then you go like, oh, it's a robot. Okay, well, so then the round things are wheels and the tubes are like pipes and oh, it's not. Oh, it's a monster. Okay, well then these round things are going to be like bulbs or eggs and the tubes are going to be like you know uh, I don't know, spines or something like that. I mean, it's just all shapes.
Did
And sometimes I don't even have the time to like iterate on that. I'm like, oh well, deadline's coming. I better just detail these out in some way, in some kind of way. So
did you know from the start that the things on Electrogore's back was going to be uranium
oh yeah, yeah,
pods?
yeah. That was part of the
Uh,
main. That was part of the thing where there actually early on plot stuff was really I'd really planned out a lot of plot stuff. And over that's one of the things that I really realized over the course of time where it's like that's not as the intricacies of the plot if it doesn't have to do with a prison trope or a monster gag or anything like that. I might as well just drop it, because there are a lot of mechanisms behind, like the character of Daniel, the
yeah.
goat, sad goat man. He was going to have a power of bad luck, and there's a hint at it, like that, like he just sort of radiates bad luck out on people, and it's like, that you could make that into a story, but it gets a little bit high fantasy, and I felt like I don't want to do that. I just want things to sort of work as they seem like they should, like
Yeah.
have them work like the way they would in a prison drama. There were other, the island was going to be secret, and the prisoners were going to be like, or sorry, the guards were going to be people who had been drugged and brainwashed. I mean, like there was all kinds of like science fiction slash fantasy plot stuff that is just outside the scope of this satire.
So
And
there was no point to him. Would the bad luck power have been controllable or uncontrollable for Daniel?
it was going to sort of be like uncontrollable, but he could just choose where he goes, like that he was going to sort of like go, and his bad luck was going to get the guards to look up the file on his tormentors, like, or whatever. It was,
That sounds like it would have been annoying to manage.
yeah, it would be,
Yeah.
and it was like, what does that have to do with prison, really?
Yeah.
Like it served well as a character building sort of woe is me type of thing, but it wasn't going to work well as a plot element.
Yeah. Well, how did you feel shining a light on things like kaiju movies with, kids who love these kaiju, but they're destroying these things. They're destroying these cities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I thought, I mean, a lot of that stuff was just, oh, I watched this movie 50 times or whatever. I watched this Ultraman episode 10 times with my son or whatever. And then you just get to thinking, you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why are these kids so into Gamera or whatever? Like, he really is not. He does not reward this kind of attention, and that's just fun. I mean, that stuff's just funny, like I
Yeah.
thought that was it was fun to kind of do all those takes on Gamera with this turtle, this dumb looking turtle thing, and then bring him back as a ghost, which is even dumber. I just, I mean, a lot of that stuff was just sort of like, oh, that's my obsession. I love it. Let's just give it this barest sort of like structure of a crime story, and there we go.
Or like in that case, it's more something like, let's just ask the most obvious question there is.
Yeah, right. Well, and I like too that it had consequence. Like it wasn't just a parody of it wasn't just Mad Magazine parody of it, like in pointing out how silly it is. It's like, oh, it's silly, but like, but then it also pays off, like the little boy at the end, and have never having lost faith in him kind of stuff. And I think that it's fun to sort of like do the gag, but then also pay it off as a real like consequential story idea, which
Yeah.
is that's the sort of stuff that I always really like about that stuff. Because I mean, again, it's like I'd originally thought of Kaijumax as being a pretty short series because you could just you could do 6 issues just with jokes alone, and you could sustain yourself. But after that, I think that people would be like, I've got it. I've seen all the jokes. So you have to have characters that people care about, or else people will just peel off pretty easily.
Did you hear about any particular character that people particularly latched onto?
Well, everybody says, "Oh, I love Daniel. The sad. He's so sad." And it's like, "Oh yeah, I like And it was funny because people always and they liked Electrogore and they liked all these and they of course they hated several characters, which I felt like that's like that's like a feather in my cap. Like, oh, I made a character that you hated. That's awesome.
I think you're supposed to hate
uh,
Zahn.
yeah, right. I mean, Zahn or Helmoth or all these
Yeah.
characters that it's like they're kind of just by the numbers villains, but it's like, oh, if you sort of work out the mechanics in your story in just such a way, people are like, ah, he's the worst. And it's like, yeah, he's the worst. But I remember really liking characters that like the character called Dingwing, who was like a pteranodon. Uh, and he never really had much of an arc. He wasn't very deep. He was pretty shallow character, and I really liked him because he was so useful in a scene because you could always rely on him to have a sort of dumb non sequitur joke that would kind of tie the scene together. And I always really liked him. So he was the final character that you see in the whole series,
Yeah.
which I think which was absolutely just me being self-indulgent. It's like this is my favorite. Everybody else has done their bow and left, and he's the last one. So
And it's such a great nod to kaiju movies where it's like, oh yeah, okay, he's dead. Here he is now as a mecha kaiju.
that's right. That's right. And he was super fun. Well, and it's like my curse is that I would always design characters. I'm like, this character is like, or I would design characters as a one-off, and I'd be like, and then I'd be like, oh, I don't have to be efficient about it. Like they can have scales and they can have like all kinds of details and stuff. And then I'd like them too much, and then I keep bringing them back, and I'm like, oh, now I gotta draw them again. But this is like the last page. I'm like, great. I can design him. I can make him as detailed as I want because I never have to draw him again. And then of course, just like a week ago, I did a commission of him, and I'm like, oh yeah, how does that all that work again?
Where's that drawing I did the first time?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I totally have to. I mean, there's no character designs. I never did any character designs outside of the comic. They were always designed like this in the first page they showed up. And the
Really?
I oh yeah, and if they would I would design their back when they would turn around, and maybe they never did, and so I never designed their back. Like and early on, I think that you can tell that there's some really like Mecha-san is very divergent in his designs. Like I really had to kind of figure it out later. Like, oh yeah, okay, I need to kind of stick with this design instead of like just drawing whatever
Because the
seemed
physics
cool at the
wasn't
time.
working.
Physics wasn't working, or it's just a little bit inconsistent, or yeah. but um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'd always kind of design, and I would always try to design them in the sort of middle distance. So when they were maybe this tall, so that you don't put too much detail, because I think that you can sort of handicap yourself by putting in too much detail, and then it takes away from their how iconic they are, and then it also gets hard to put them in the background because you're like, oh, how do I minimize this detail or these stripes or these conduits? But if you draw them in the middle distance, then it's like, oh, they get closer. You can just kind of add more detail, add more scuffs or nicks or things, and then in the background, you've already kind of scaled them back. So
I think I want to talk a little bit about Zahn because I think he's such a great antagonist, and I think a huge part of that is just very simply the way that you draw him. Because you do mention that it is like he is a by the numbers villain. There's nothing
yeah.
redeemable about him at all, but it's just the way you draw him is like he's like leaning against the cliff or
Yeah,
just chilling as if
yeah.
he was on
The
a
body
couch.
language does a lot for this, especially for something so like sort of mushy and weird looking, like not very threatening looking other than his eyes. uh yeah, he's all weird colors, and I mean I really think that if you were like, oh, I need to have a villain for my kaiju movie, and that was the design you came up with, it would be rejected because it's dumb, it's bad colors. Yeah, like he's weird and he has feathers. Like what's there's nothing really there's he's not a well designed character. But I always kind of like that sort of the design diktat that I came up with in my head for Kaijumax is that everything has to look like it could be operated by a person in a suit, and B, like
It's a great
there's no
diktat.
there's no problem with things being dumb looking. like like they could I everything is no things don't have to look cool or awesome. They can look dumb and silly because it's supposed to not just be about monster movies, but about like 60s monster movies, which where they all look dumb, you
Yeah.
know? And so I think it was really fun to be able to design this character who really looks like the bottom of the barrel monster wise and make him hopefully a really effective, sinister villain.
It is a great dictile, which is like it can potentially be created into a series with the aesthetics of a 60s, monster show.
Yeah.
You
Well, and I
even use
think
the
too,
same
like,
moves.
yeah, that's right. Well, I think that if you wanted to make something that's like, if you had a character who's really mean and sinister and he looked like Shin Godzilla, who's sort of like nightmarish in his sort of look, it'd be like, it's kind of like a hat on a hat. It's just, obviously he'd be a villain. He's terrifying. But if he looks dumb, like well, I think about Gabara from All Monsters Attack, which is that 1968, 69 Godzilla movie. He's the monster that bullies Godzilla's son, and he's just absurd looking. He kind of looks like a cat. He has weird hair, like sort of globs on his body. He's dumb, but he's like this villain. He's a menacing villain in this movie, and it's like I don't know. I kind of wanted to capture
Yeah.
that sort of silliness. Yeah,
The romance between Zahn
yeah.
and Dr. Zhang. Where did that come from?
That's straight from like prison dramas, but also prison, like true prison things. Like that's how people smuggle in drugs. That's how people smuggle in money, and like whatever they need is either like blackmailing someone or sort of like seducing a guard or having something over on them, bribing people. I mean, it's I wanted to give her. I mean, she really only showed up in that issue where she's sort of saying like, "Oh, I have a lot of empathy for people and stuff like that," and I wanted that to be true. Like that's a true and it's a good thing, but it also like it has a, for her character had a flip side. And yeah, I mean, I think that she was kind of a fascinating character because initially I had planned to do a women's prison, but I didn't. She wasn't really part of it. I didn't think that she was necessarily going to be a character in it. But I think that by the time I'd gotten to that point, it's like, oh yeah, okay. So here's a character who is a villain. I mean, is sort of like structurally set up as a villain. She's done all kinds of harm to the characters that we like, um, and she's a murderer. um, but it's like, oh yeah, well, she murdered somebody who nobody's sorry to see go, and then like I could have it. I could true. It's like I had looked at all the things that she'd done, and I'm like, okay, there's nothing that's really sort of like disqualifying her as sort of an anti-hero. There's nothing that people go like, no way can I get on her side. Hopefully, like she just is sort of like somebody who'd kind of been led down a path that didn't really have any good exits. So that was fun, and a lot of it was happenstance. It was kind of just lucky that it worked out that way.
How did you feel about doing the bait and switch where it looked like it was going to be come down to Mechazon versus Zon, and then not at all?
I thought that was kind of. I mean, again, I'm not usually a fan of like having something not happen, but I thought that was kind of fun in that like, excuse me, we could see from his point of view and all of his weapons and targeting and stuff like that, and then have him sort of be true to his principles, for
Yeah.
once. And of course, it's like a good thing too because that would have been a short fight because it was page 21 or whatever, like we were done with that issue. And I was really, I another sort of rule for myself was that I wasn't going to have any sort of like two-parters in that like issue 3 is the first half of the story and issue 4 is the second half of the story, and there was just a cliffhanger in the middle. I never wanted to have any cliffhangers that didn't sort of like operate as the end of that story.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it was the end of a
So
story, the beginning of the next.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I never wanted to just be like, what will happen next week, next month, next 6 weeks or whatever.
What were some elements that stuck with you from the beginning to the end of the book? Would you say that most of it stuck with you from beginning to the end?
That like that it what stayed the same and what changed, you mean, from the
Yeah.
beginning to the end? Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I
Did
think,
you ditch
again,
anything, that you had planned or?
I mean, like I said, I ditched a lot of the sort of like the fantasy slash science fiction uh sort of plot stuff that was kind of behind the scenes. I just feel like the mechanics of everything had to basically just work like prison would, and then, and it was nice to be able to sort of fudge things like, oh, you know, like I remember writing scenes that were much more sort of like focused on what are the logistics for smuggling drugs into this prison or whatever, and it's like it doesn't matter, like I'm basically just saying there's force fields around it. You can I can say that these characters defeated force fields in any number of ways. There's no point in getting into the logistics of it because it doesn't matter. um uh yeah, I mean, again, I think that it got less tropey because I kind of ran out of like the classic prison tropes, and I started sort of consuming less prison drama stuff and reading more prison memoirs. And so I wanted to sort of incorporate a lot of that, because that what starts to emerge from real prison memoirs is that you're like, all over, besides all the stuff that gets sensationalized, the main thing about prison is that it's boring. Like you just have to fill your days. All these people are just sort of saying like, I have to make myself a schedule or I'll go nuts. And so it's like I keep to this schedule, and some of it's made for me, but some of it is just sort of like, well, first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and yeah, and there was a lot of stuff like sort of have somebody having a tattoo prison hustle, and somebody, and like the commissary, and how sort of fundamental and sort of central that is, and how your money that you earn by doing little prison jobs, or that people send in from outside, how much that means, and how much that's sort of like a marker of class in prison. And I mean, again, it's like it's always gonna be pulpy. It's always gonna be violent, and sort of uh everybody's got to have their head on a swivel and all that stuff. But like I wanted to just sort of like cover a couple other things and have it be a little, and have I felt like it was so downbeat at the beginning that I wanted to sort of have an uplift for characters, like that they're not necessarily like getting free necessarily, or or sort of being triumphant, but that they could sort of find their place in the world and deal with it, whether that meant that they were still in prison, or whether that meant that they were out, or it just meant that they kind of had freed their mind, whatever that means.
What was it like juggling the ensemble cast? Like, did you ever have a thing where you were like, I really wish I could get back to this guy now, but I'm in the middle of this one?
Yeah, yeah, and a lot of times that was another thing. Like every season, I would sort of have like a whole plot line that I had wanted to put in there, but it didn't fit, and so I'm just you had to kick that can down the road, and that was always just sort of like my move. But that was the problem when I got to the sixth season. I'm like, there's no more road. Like all these cans have got to fit, And so you can kind of see behind me there's a board uh, that has a bunch of post-it notes on it, and that was how I plotted things out. Like I would color code every storyline, and then I would just kind of, and then I would have six rows and however many columns that was, and so then I would sort of do it scene by scene, and then I could kind of at a glance go like, oh yeah, there's a little bit of green in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth issue, and that's that one person's storyline. And sometimes it's like, oh, it'll, there's the hints in the first issue, and then it resolves itself in issue 4, something like that. And that was how I would juggle stuff, is by having a board like that, because I think that it's easy to forget about characters if they're not doing something, or if they didn't sort of like capture your imagination, even if they're sort of like crucial to the plot mechanism. Um, and so yeah, that was usually my that was that was my method like that. And I always wanted to make sure that there was a reason for them to be around, that they were doing something interesting. We weren't just sort of like checking in on them doing nothing.
Yeah.
um, the nice thing about being in a confined space is that you can always just sort of put someone in the background and be like, there he is. Like we don't even have to see what he's doing, but like, yeah, he's still alive, he's fine, like, all right, next scene.
Is there ever a thing where it's like, I have to be careful to not show this character because then it'll take attention away from the front scene, like I have to be careful not to show Zahn because people are going to be wondering why he's in this. Or
Yeah, I mean, kind of. I mean, it was pretty organic. I could sort of feel like, uh, I was hopefully that like the foregrounded scene is the most interesting thing that you want to see. There's no reason to wonder about other stuff, but it wasn't anything conscious that I did.
uh, the the character of Gupta, I feel like he just kind of disappeared, didn't he?
Yeah, I would have liked to have paid him off better, but I mean, he became that monster guy on the moon.
Yeah,
Like that. Well, and that was all just a reference to uh this character called Ultraman Belial, he's in sort of like the 2010s Ultraman movies, and sort of he's very monstery, but he has the Ultraman sort of look to him, and I thought, oh, that's kind of a cool thing. Like, I mean, it doesn't really make any sense from a crime story that they would like resurrect this dead character and turn him into a monster, but I kind of like the idea that he would just basically serve as sort of like a hitman character, and that was something that I wish that I'd had more time or more space to do, was have this Gupta character be sort of a silent hitman type for this cartel of
yeah,
rabbits that live on the moon. Um, but every time I would go to the moon, it was sort of like taking focus away from the prison or whichever prison I was in at the time. And so I just kind of de-emphasized that a little bit, which is too bad because I put so much effort into those rabbits, like, because they were all based on sort of like what cultures sort of had like myths about a rabbit on the moon. So
yeah.
like there's a Chinese one, a Korean one, a Japanese one, a like a Mesoamerican, uh I think it was like Aztec or something, and then a Cree nation from North America. And it's like, they have tattoos that are in their language, and like, there's all these like, I was looking up like um sort of, oh no, it was a Mayan phrase that we could use as a tattoo. I don't know. So I spent so much time figuring that out, and then I never really used them.
The ending of Gupta came to me as a bit of a rush because I'm like, wow,
Yeah,
because I think that was the first time in the series where I was like, wow, Xander's just gonna get rid of characters as much as he wants to, isn't he?
yeah, it's prison drama, baby. But yeah, I mean, I had wanted to kill him off in the first season, but then I didn't like the way it worked. So I was like, oh yeah, I'll save him, resurrect him. Uh, and then because that was really rushed. The first season, I was still figuring out how much time and space I had to work out, scenes. Like I would overplot it, and then it's like, oh, I don't have enough pages to do it, and so I wanted to I wanted to have him be back and have him be a bad influence on Dr. Zhang. But yeah, like uh I did want him to be sort of like a psych out, like, oh yeah, Mechazon and Electric are gonna team up and kill this guy, and then, oh, he's dead. Like, I don't know. I mean, it's a good fake out for a pulpy prison drama, like where you
Yeah.
think, oh, it's gonna be the battle of the century. Oh no, it's not.
You did that twice.
I know. Well, it's never say I don't go back to the what works, I guess.
Zhang and his very early on uh kills a kid, a criminal kid, but a kid. And suffers PTSD because of it. How much of that was, driven? Was it at all driven by an advocacy for PTSD, or was it another prison
uh,
trope? Or
yeah, actually, I mean, well, it's a crime drama trope and stuff, and I think that back then I was more interested than I am now in sort of like, you know in showing sort of the cop's point of view. But yeah, I had done a series uh, for the Department of Defense. I'd done a bunch of stuff about PTSD and vets, and I had sort of did a lot of comic strips that sort of helped explain this sort of online tool, this online drawing tool that would help people sort of like tell their traumatic stories about their deployments and work through the feelings that it brought up and that kind of thing. And so I had been sort of immersed in all that sort of research about PTSD, and I felt like it was, and I mean, it's obviously thematically fits. So I wanted to make sure that we had a character who had this sort of like very specific type of PTSD, and he was basically a carefree character, or sort of like your standard cop until that moment, and then he was kind of consumed by this PTSD, and then and then I didn't really intend to make his story quite so central, but once I wanted to make sure that we show that he has this sort of slow but definite path out of it, that he can sort of like, he can find love, but then he also struggles with it, and what sorts of things, what sorts of decisions that it sort of leads him into. So yeah, I was very interested in having a character who had PTSD and working through it in a way, not in a way that is completely accurate, obviously, because he's a super robot and he has like weapons and armor and stuff. I
Yeah.
mean, but I thought that was like pretty apt. I thought that was a pretty apt metaphor. I mean, it's little on the nose, but it was kind of fun because it's like, when somebody like evolves and has like rockets and guns and stuff on their armor in tokusatsu stuff, it's like, it's sweet, it's awesome, like get ready for a beatdown for the monsters. But now it's like, oh yeah, it's still going to give the monsters a beatdown, but it's destroying him. Like it's making him feel awful at all times, and it's weighing him down.
It's just you turning that genre on its ear.
Yeah, I mean, there's no tokusatsu like trope that I can't make sad and grim. Like the funnest, most awesome movies. Let's like, oh, let's take that idea and make it the saddest thing you've ever seen. That's
But drawn in your style so people
Yeah,
won't think you're doing that.
I know. Yeah, I don't know. It's worked out in a way that I never could have planned. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
whether it's better or worse, it's definitely not something that I planned.
Zhang's romance with the robot Chisato. They have a child. I'm going to ask you the most obvious question here,
Yeah,
Xander,
yeah.
which
And
is
I'm gonna give you the answer. Yeah.
how?
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you the answer that I always gave everybody. It's like, I don't know, like 3D printing or something. Like, who knows? Uh, yeah, I like the idea that like, okay, she sort of like protects him in that sort of like ball that's, like she's like one of those anatomy like models that you get at the art store. That like that little ball that's at her sort of midsection. Then I was like, oh well, maybe she 3D scanned him or something like that, and like that was whatever. I just kind of liked the idea that it's like, yeah, I mean, if you want a fig leaf to make this make internal sense, I'll riff something on, in the moment and figure it out. But it's a satire. You just have to take it as it comes, I guess. But yeah, anyway, again,
There,
I wanted to show like, again, what his life is going to be like with a child on the way, and these sort of obligations piling up. But so,
there is a scene in which she gets assaulted, and you are very careful to make it very clear that she's not a victim in this situation. Right? You do mention that that's a
yeah,
reaction to certain tropes.
maybe, yeah. And it's tired. It's a tired idea that somebody would be, and I mean, this is a character who has been in the comics since like the very beginning and shown herself to be super resourceful and super competent and super tough. And it would be silly to make her a victim in that way, because it's like, well, this isn't a revenge. This isn't a revenge thriller. It's where some her husband has to go track down the killer, not killer, but the sort of the perpetrator. And so I just wanted to sort of say like, you know, this is, you messed up, and this is what happens. And now it's not something that just happened to Jong. It's not just something that happened to the husband. It's something that happened to their family. And she's furious at him about it because he's done something so stupid. And
Yeah.
I don't think that you have to be so granular about that kind of stuff, but I also that again, it's like I late in the series I wanted to get away from sort of like your usual tropes. I wanted to sort of say like, okay, we can have the thrills, we can have the scenes that are violent or exciting or transgressive or whatever, but let's let's look at them from a more modern perspective instead of just being like playing the hits of the 70s, the 70s, crime dramas or whatever.
Talking about your usual tropes and shining a light on them and turning it on its ear. The storyline towards the end with Matsumoto and Midori-chan. Uh, I do feel like
Yeah.
that is a reaction. It's something that you can plainly see in a lot of things where,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, so yeah, that it's funny. I was talking to two people like within a couple days who were like, what I really want? I really want Nobuko Matsumoto to get her to sort of have a redemption arc. And then like I was talking to somebody else like 2 days later, like they're like, what I really don't want is for Nobuko Matsumoto to have a redemption arc. And I was like, huh, it's interesting that you would both bring it up, and mention it. And I felt like, well, yeah, you're right. I don't want her to have a redemption arc to say like she's succeeded and because she's done so much harm to so many people. And I didn't want her to sort of like have an easy way out. Like, oh yeah, and everything worked out great for this person who has been like corrupt and sort of serving her own interests for 50 years. But I also wanted to say like this is a person who's been kicked around by this system in various ways, and even in her disgrace, she can sort of say, like, I want to make one thing right, and that's to get my successor out of that same situation that I was in. Because and maybe her motives are selfish, but she sees it happening and she wants to do one good thing, and I didn't want to be like, oh, one good thing, sacrifice yourself. It's like, and she lives at the end. She doesn't want to, she doesn't die, but she just is um, just I can just frame it that she does this one good thing without making it big, without making it too cliched, whatever.
Yeah.
And actually, that character of Midori, I did not intend to have her be like a main character. I just put her in at the very end of that
Of season
fifth
5.
season,
Yeah.
yeah, season 5, to just be like, oh yeah, here she is. She kind of looks like Sailor Moon or whatever, and she's got green hair because her name is Midori. And then, but then I was just like, and then I had watched Evangelion, and so I was like, well, all right, let's age her up a little bit and just show how much driving a mech like that messes her up.
I
Um,
think, yeah, I think that was when you drew the one with the one scientist with his hand, with her hand clearly slapping him.
yeah, I mean, yeah, some of this stuff is so grim that you can't get too far into it. So I put each of the signs like in a row. Like one has the slap on his, and it's not as obvious, but it shows like the other one. She gave him a wedgie. Like you can kind of see the waistband of his underwear.
Yeah.
And then the third one, like she kicked him in the nuts, like you see little stars or whatever. And I was like, all right, well I mean, it's a little bit broad, but you know, you can only spend so much time with all of these things. So
Yeah, not enough time.
yeah,
Um,
not enough time, and you don't want to go. I mean, as grim as this comic gets, it it's only so grim. It's PG-13 grim,
yeah.
as far as I view it. And so it's just like, all right, I just let's keep all that sort of stuff like a little off camera.
I'm gonna talk to you about my favorite issue of the whole series, and
I can't wait.
I'm gonna ask you how many people have said it's their favorite issue. But
Mhm.
it's the one where Go Go Space Baby uh
Yeah.
goes and meets her kid, Space.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Okay. The fourth issue of the final season.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
fourth
Well,
issue of the final season.
well, that's great. A couple people have said that. Yeah. Well, I mean, so another thing that's something that obviously somebody who gives birth in prison and uh, is sort of forced, or not forced, but like compelled to place the baby for adoption, is obviously that's something that plays out all the time, and it's so sad and it's so grim. And and she came to realize the second he was born that the father wasn't coming back, and um, but yeah, the characters of the parents in the nebula, this sort of space superhero parents, I mean, in a way, that's position that I'm in. My wife and I have a son who was adopted, and he's Korean, and so his position as being a person of color in the United States, especially in the state we live in, Minnesota, which is pretty white, um, puts him in this strange position of being uh, of in a lot, in a lot of cases, the only person of color in the room, not necessarily at school, but like it happens a lot. And I wanted to sort of, we had a lot of experience meeting other adoptive parents, white adoptive parents, and there's a lot of ugliness in there, in that's just baked into how people talk about adoption, how people talk about having kids who are racial, like having a multiracial family, and how, I don't know, and how like you can't just sort of like shrug your shoulders and pretend like it's not there. Um, and so yeah, I wanted to sort of show, I mean, through the magic of space, it's comic books and space superhero magic, whatever. I wanted to sort of show this like cross section of his whole life. Uh, and I mean, it's sadder than what I hope my son will experience. Um,
Hopefully.
but yeah, right. But I thought it's not gruesome, it's not irredeemable, it's not the worst life somebody could live, but it's but that there are challenges all along the way. And anyway, I just yeah, that was an important issue to me, and I had intended to do a lot of other, like, cut away to a lot of other stories, but instead I just focused on that was the main story, that's the main arc, and then the Electrogore stuff. um
Yeah.
and it was kind of fun to be like, oh, okay, here's the blue scene, and then here's the orange scene. Like it's the most clear way of delineating these two parallel storylines, is that they're very, very different in color.
You seemed surprised when I told you that was my favorite issue. Uh,
Well, I guess what I a lot of people has thought the issue, or a lot of people said that the issue with Go-Go Space Baby giving birth, and that twist and that reveal, and it's like, and that was my favorite issue for a while. Like I was like, I was like, oh, I don't always nail it on the timing for all these
yeah.
comics, but like that one was like, and also like there aren't very many twists. There's only so many twists in this comic. I mean, there's some, but there's not. But I don't feel like it's the hallmark of the comic that there's a twist. And so I really liked that twist, and I really liked that these two characters basically were put in a position that it wasn't really either one of their fault, and it was completely irrevocable and unfixable.
That's such a great twist because you totally should have seen it coming.
Right, right, right. You're like, I know this cartoonist. He has a sick sense of humor. Uh,
Well, it's not even just that. It's like for the first time in a while, you show Zahn in a flashback.
yeah, I know. Yeah,
And it's like, why would he be doing this all of a
yeah,
sudden? And
yeah.
then
Oh, she's
the
just
only
racked with
thing
guilt. There's just no reason to show it except that she's just racked with guilt, and then it's like, boom, gotcha.
the only thing Zhang and Go-Go Space Baby are talking about the whole time are the boyfriend that Zhang has killed and Go-Go Space Deity's baby daddy,
Yeah,
who is coincidentally never showing up. So
yeah, man, oh man.
so it's all
Yeah,
right
like,
there. And I saw it and I was like, huh, I didn't see that coming at all.
right. I know. I was like, oh, that's why that was my favorite one. That was my favorite issue for a while, just because it was like, oh man, that was just so satisfying to pull off that the bait and switch, and like, and the twist, that's you would think that that's basic. That's the basic thing that everybody should be able to do in writing fiction. But it's like, man, it's hard. It's hard to like trick people into thinking that. something of no consequence is about to happen, and then it's like, ooh, it's huge twist. I've been setting it up for for hundreds of pages.
One of the things that really struck me about this book, about this whole series, is that you made up whole songs, including, I might add, a whole play riffing off of Hamilton.
Yeah, well, and it's funny too because it's like Hamilton was, well, let's see, that was probably a couple of years after Hamilton had come out, but I had suddenly like started to listen to it, and I was like, oh, this is really good, like late to the party as usual. And then but I mean, obviously you can, it's music in comics, of course, doesn't work, but I thought, well, rapping, especially this character who is already sort of like the free, sort of the prison freestyler, and I was like, oh, that would be really fun to sort of, because it's just rhyming couplets basically, because you can't do anything too much more complicated than that, or else people won't parse it correctly. And then and so anyway, I just thought it would be kind of, I mean, it'd be fun to do it because it's silly and it's weird, but two, it was fun to sort of drill down on like Godzilla, the or 1954 Godzilla, and be like, here's a bunch of stuff about like the specifics of this actual movie, so I can kind of make fun of like the scientist guy kind of like self-consciously tucking in his tie, like all these sort of tiny little things. The fact that he says that the dinosaur age was 2 million years ago, it's like, ha, 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 let's make fun of that. And and
Are you
or
Raymond
like,
Burr, sir?
yeah, the Raymond Burr. I mean, like that was just handed to me on a silver platter. Like that was pretty good. And but the best thing is I got to hand that issue to Lin-Manuel Miranda at Comic-Con. Like
Really?
he just happened to be there. I was at a party. Someone was like, Lin-Manuel Miranda's here. I'm like, oh, let me meet this guy. I'm gonna go find him. So I met him. I told him about the comic, and then he was walking around the show later in a Deadpool costume, so that he wouldn't be recognized. But he took off the mask, and I was like, oh, there he is. So like, I gave him the issue, and yeah. So
Wow.
that was fun. That was a nice little completing of the circle. You know, I mean,
Okay.
yeah, I don't know him. He's. But
Okay, guys, we learned today that Lin-Manuel Miranda might be walking around Comic Cons in a Deadpool costume.
I would say that if you see somebody who's walking around in a so-so costume that covers their face, like there is like probably a 25% chance they're like the most famous person or the most famous person you could think of. Because I mean, I know that like Elliot Page was walking around one year as Rorschach, and like, I mean, they're just, I think that and you think about it, it's like, oh man, this is the time that you can walk around with a full face mask. I mean, other than like mask, but like you can walk around with like a full costume and face mask and not have anybody think it's weird. Like it's like perfect for super celebrities to walk around and be anonymous.
That is awesome. Yeah. Uh, and Daniel's storyline. That was
Oh, yeah.
that was something because, first of all, like he's the saddest person. He's the
Right,
sad
person. I
he's the
know.
saddest.
I always say people do this in my comic. I'm like, oh no, not people. Okay, yeah, yeah. Saddest goat man. Uh,
His mom is a Satanist. His dad is Satan.
I know. Well, so that was funny too because I have this obsession with putting, say, like weird devil stuff in my comics. Like, but I thought it was fun too to be able to say like, oh, okay, here's so sort of satanic and sort of like, diabolical imagery. Like that's always fun to do. But then I was like, oh, okay, like let's have her be, obviously she kind of looks like a pilgrim or sort of Puritan, and let's have her like quote scripture at people. But I was like, well, what scripture? Well, obviously I'm going to go to the Satanic Bible, like Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, and it's funny because you read it and you're like, what a bunch of wanky nonsense this is. Like it's so like it's just somebody like coming up with a couple philosophical ideas to justify being a selfish prick. And I just thought that I was like, oh, that's funny. Like, I mean, and I'd read some of it before, but it's like, oh, that's like a funny thing. And so anyway, I wanted to put all that stuff in there uh and have her treat it with like utmost seriousness, like she's reading from like the Bible in the year 600 or whatever. Um And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I always like putting in satanic stuff in because of too, like my art style always makes it kind of funny. Like, oh, let's have, these weird, funny little devils with funny little pitchforks. Like it's just that's just a fun thing to do when you have a silly cartoony style, is like make something that's scary, or sort of gruesome, and draw it in that weird style.
And I think it's one of the moments in the book that got like a real emotional reaction out of me, which was when he crossed the river, and he turned
Yeah,
into a goat.
yeah. Well, and it's like that, and that scene from every mob movie where it's like, let's take a walk, like lefty, whatever, and then they go and they're being whacked in a parking lot somewhere, and uh yeah, I wanted to give it that same weight, but of course it's something so silly that he just that he crosses running water, so he's an evil character, so he or not evil, but he's an evil
He's a
creature.
he's a demon.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So that he has, and I don't know why I said oil turned him into a regular goat, but it worked fine for
yeah.
that scene.
I will have to ask, like, how does he survive Helmoth like stomping on him?
I don't know. You ever like try to step on a cockroach and it like he stays alive? I don't know. Happens
Okay.
sometimes.
Okay. The way that his story ends is very satisfying. Like, he kind of comes into his own.
Yeah, it was really satisfying to me that like I had a couple different people tell me that was like their favorite panel was him coming back and being in like full like monster Krampus demon style, and like and hugging his friend, who's and telling his friend not to overdose on heroin or or uranium.
Uranium. Yeah.
Yeah. um yeah, like and of course it's like, I spent a lot of time coloring that because I'm like, oh boy, like, a cool like sunset. I'm always like putting in a cool sunset because it's like you got to show the sky in every panel, and
Yeah.
sometimes you want to show off a little bit, I guess.
I want to ask about one more character that I thought was pretty insane, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but it's that magic unicorn guy.
Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, people say it wrong all the time, but like I read it a bunch of places, and they're like, anyway, he was called Sprinkles the Unidragon.
Yes.
Yeah, now I can't remember. Yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Um, that was one of those things, which was once again, it's like this is clearly a very tried and true children's character.
Right. Yeah, that was because so I had watched all these. Well, and of course, when I was a kid, they had those Puff the Magic Dragon specials on TV, like in the late '70s and early '80s. Of course, we watched them because that you got to watch something on TV, right? And going back to watch them, I was like, they're fun. Like I remember them being weird, but I was like, well, you watch them, you're like, man, they sure seem to think that kids should go off with some smooth talking stranger, and like who's gonna like solve their problems with a wave of his hand or a puff of smoke. I mean, literally in those things, he like puffs smoke at people, and they can see so clearly through this smoke ring, and it's like, yeah, that's messed up. Like, or it's funny to say, and then okay, well now I'm gonna take this funny, weird kind of non sequitur thing, and I'm gonna make it the worst thing that you could possibly imagine. So, um, yeah, and then
Yeah.
it was fun to sort of go back and be like, oh yeah, let's talk about all these other things. Let's talk about let's like talk about the Magic School Bus. Let's talk about James and the Giant. Like there's some references to James and the Giant Peach in there, and like all these things where like a child has to sort of like kind of ditch their parents or parental figures and and talk to some magic man or whatever. It's like, yeah, anyway.
It's it's like so obviously messed up, but we just took it for what it was.
I know, yeah, right. And then of course, yeah. So I'm like, okay, so let's make it the worst possible thing. Okay, oh yeah, he eats the bus like a burrito, and anyway, yeah, it was very satisfying, I think.
Cycling back to Electrogore, I think one of the most satisfying things was when he is finally reunited with his children, his daughter Torgax does not want anything to do with him because as far as she's concerned, he abandoned them.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter that he was captured or anything. And then, it becomes your angsty uh, your
Yeah,
angsty
I wanted
teenager
to.
for a
I
while.
kind of wanted to make kind of skip over. the angsty teenager thing and kind of have her be like a traumatized young adult, like
Yeah.
that somebody who is sort of like has had to so like overcompensate for not having any support that she becomes hard armored up, and so and well, again, it's like with the PTS, all the stuff that with PTSD, we always there's a thing that kept coming up that I always thought was an interesting phrasing. They talked about PTSD as being a moral injury, and I always like the idea that like more so than being traumatized by like sights and sounds or like you know, explosions or things that happen to your body, you are traumatized by decisions that you've made or mistakes that you've made, and you know, that may have been necessary, that may have been tactical errors, but like that's the thing that really weighs on people. And I kind of like the idea that she's sort of like, well, you know, that she's had to sort of like hustle and do all kinds of sort of like morally compromised things to sort of take care of her brother. And I don't know, I liked to give her that. I mean, I didn't ever just want to make her be like a teen that's just unpleasant. You know, it's
Yeah.
like, I mean, well, like, there's plenty of that later, you know, uh, but yeah,
Yeah.
I thought she was and I, you know, and again, it's like he's getting the thing that he always wanted by the end of that season to get back to his kids, but it was, I guess I can't. Nothing could be easy, you know. Like,
Yeah.
or I
Absolutely.
wanted the one moment where he finds his son. That's exactly what he hoped for. Finds his son. That's great. And then of course, uh, everything is shot to hell when he sees his daughter. So
But even you know the morally compromisable things that she has to do to support her and her brother. I mean, even that is absurdly funny when you draw it.
yeah, right. Yeah, like someone's licking her, the uranium that comes out of her back. I mean, it's pretty dumb. Yeah,
But then also at the same time, you think about what that actually means and how that translates
yeah,
to human beings.
yeah,
And it's like, oh, now I'm really disturbed.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, like you have to be completely immersed in this comic to sort of go like, oh, that's that absurd panel, which to anyone else with no context would be like, all right, whatever. But then you see, you're like, oof, you know, that's awful.
Uh, how did it feel giving that particular storyline closure?
uh, yeah, I mean, I mean, it's great. I think that um, there's a temptation when you sort of like are working on something for a long time to be like, you know, when people are like, well, how's it going to wrap up? You know, to be like, yeah, well, you know, all debts are paid and everybody sort of like, you know, everything is set right, and I never really wanted to do that. I mean, you want to. I think that you have to sort of like answer the questions that you set up. Like, will Electricor's family ever sort of be reunited? And the answer is like, sorta. You know, like not really. I mean, he gets to be with his son, and he knows that his daughter is sort of like being taken care of for the moment, and or is happy for the moment. And I think that it's important to sort of say like, you know, yeah, I'm answering that you know, I'm answering your yes or no question with a yes, but you know, like, is it exactly how everybody imagined? No, like that's what stories are like. You know, you spend the
What
first
life
two
is
acts
like.
get yeah, that's what life is like. But I mean, yeah, you spend the first two acts getting to what you think is the goal, and then you realize no, the goal is something else, and then you have the final act to get to that. And I think that that's, you know, I, I wanted to give it some. I feel like you have to resist the effort, resist the sort of um, the temptation to always want to hit that bass drum of like satisfying ending. You know, be like, and then they destroyed the empire once and for all. I just felt like, at least in this story, a satire and a, you know, an ensemble cast. The answers can't ever be that simple, you know,
You
or no one would buy it. I
you have a
mean,
nice bass drum at the very last page.
yeah, yeah, okay. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, but it's like I've been putting it off for years, you know, like
Yeah.
years, literal years. So
Talking about formats for this book, I mean, I think you did mention that this isn't you didn't expect this comic to make a lot of money, but you know,
and I was
uh
correct.
but good enough to publish kaiju sized editions.
Yeah,
It's not,
yeah. I mean,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think I probably, you know, I thought. I probably thought it was going to be short. But I mean, when we were talking about it, they're like, "Well, how long would you want it to be?" And I mean, I probably just pulled it out of my hat, like, "Oh, five seasons or whatever." I was like, "Oh, indefinite," and they're like, "Well, give us a number." And like, "Oh, well, five," and they're like, "Oh, how about six?" And then that was the smart move because then it's like, oh, you can combine two seasons into three, each into three hardcovers, and that worked out really nicely. Yeah, I mean, it's the book is the I mean, the book is a success in all the ways that really count, other than making me a lot of money or making me, enough money to that it's like, I don't know. I mean, my wife has a middle class teaching job. That's the only way that I could have possibly done this. There's no, like, I would love to be making even just a modest living on this, but it's always just sort of like a calculation about the future. I mean, Kaijumax has been sort of bandied around as an animated series to a bunch of we pitched it to a bunch of places, and it's funny because it's like I don't really, I mean, this I don't want to shut any doors by saying this, but I don't really have a great interest in making it into a TV show. Like that isn't a creative goal of mine necessarily. I think that it would be really fun, and I think that I would, given the opportunity, I would jump in with both feet for sure. But it's not necessarily a sort of aesthetic goal so much as it is like it's a calculation where it's like, well, it's not making any, it's not really making anybody rich as a comic. It would be nice to have it pay off in the future. Work that you've already done, pay off in the future. And I think that that's a calculation that every creator of a creator-owned project makes. You're like, well, maybe somebody will turn it into a movie. Maybe somebody.
Well, if it
I
does
mean,
get turned into an animated series, your art style would be kind of natural.
yeah, it's a very animatable style. You could make, sort of. I mean, they don't use Flash anymore, but Flash animated,
Yeah.
characters that can be sort of articulated. I mean, it'd be very easy, a very straightforward process. Um, yeah, I mean, of course, everybody is sort of like, oh, it'd be so cool if you could make it with like live action with like, costumes. And it's like, yeah, it would be great. Do you have $25 million just drop on that, like,
No,
and
no,
every
no,
one
no,
of those
no. It,
characters.
it it would be cool if it was much more lower budget and it looked like it came from the 60s.
Oh yeah, but even then, it's like you'd still have to make all those costumes. Every time a new character shows up, there's only 150 speaking roles in it. Yeah, so like, yeah, I mean, sure, I would love that. I would, and actually, what I would really love is somebody to do like a bumper, for like the TV show, like where they just start talking to each other. It's like, yeah, that's great. I would love that. Or CG animate it so that it would look like, uh, you know, look like monster suits. That would be awesome. But I think that, yeah, you'd have to. I mean, one of the things that Charlie Chu said is like you want it to be look like your style, so that when people look at it and then look at the comic, they're like, yeah, I want to buy this comic.
Yeah.
Because if nothing else, it's a $1 million ad campaign for your comic book. It's like, you are right. That's smart.
That is smart. Is there anything are there any talks that you can talk about or
Well, I mean, we pitched it all over the place, and I mean, and then the pitches change, and then the people change, and so yeah, I mean, one notably we pitched it to Quibi. I don't know if you remember Quibi, that very short-lived
yeah.
thing where the comics or the shows were going to be uh, portrait mode on your phone. So, and the funny thing was we pitched it, and they're like, yeah, we're not really looking at comedy stuff, and it's like, you're doing 10-minute shows on your phone that you watch in portrait mode, and you're not doing comedy. Anyway, whatever. But anyway,
No,
that tells you when
comedy
we were
is the
pitching it.
most.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it just
Yeah.
seems funny.
Well, good luck on that. When can we expect the kaiju size for the last two seasons?
uh about a year, well, about a year, next October. So
Next October.
uh
Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Looking, yeah,
I'm working on stuff. I mean, there's a lot of back matter and stuff. uh I did a big interview, like sort of exit interview, kind of like this one, that's going to be in, in prose in the back, and then a whole bunch of character design stuff, and then I got to do all the annotations, and then it's funny because it's like I'll write all the stuff that like all the stuff that I have to write, no problem, and then it's like I have to draw one picture. I'm like, so much work, which is so funny because it's like drawing is really not that hard, but it's like doing an illustration that like has to serve a purpose. I'm like, forget it.
Looking back on it all the last 10 years, how would you view Kaijumax?
uh, I mean, it. I think it's interesting how much it changed my career and how I thought about my career because, I mean, I did the book Heck before it, which was the first thing that I had written and drawn, by myself in a long time, and it really changed my all both of those really changed my perspective. Where it's like it was sort of if you had an art style that wasn't suitable for whatever drawing Justice League, you should either do indie comics and not make any money, or you should write DC comics or Marvel comics, and just kind of use the fact that you are an artist to be a better comic book writer, but never really do any art anymore. And I tried that. I couldn't bear it. I just couldn't bear it at all. It just was so. I mean, it kills your soul. The idea that you're like, I'd spent a lot of years learning how to be a good artist, and now like because I don't draw like whatever Neil Adams, the second coming of Neil Adams, there's really no spot for me. And so, but the idea that I could sort of say like, I'm a writer and artist. I can just make something, and then if people like it, they like it, and I don't have to like get permission to do it the way you do when you're just a writer or just an artist or just whatever. And so that was such a great realization that you kind of be like, all right, no one's really asking for a monster prison that's like Oz or whatever. No one would think to ask for it, but here it is. Oh, you like it? Great. So that's like was this great realization for me that it's like you can just make something, and if people like it, then it's the thing.
What's next for Zander Cannon?
Well, I just been sending out a lot of pitches. I've been putting out a lot of feelers to do a little bit of writing and or art for Marvel and DC. I'm working on a children's graphic novel. Finally, something with that children can read with my funny art style. Yeah,
Can you
I
talk
kind of
about
have
that
all these.
yet or no?
Well, sure. I mean, it's a, I so I was saying that like I would spend all that time trying to be a writer for Marvel and DC. It's like, well, I pitched all these things for Batman, Adam Strange, Superman, Wonder Woman, this, and like, of course, they were like, no way, like all these things. There, because I was a little naive, and I'd be like, oh well, yeah, like this is just something that's gonna no big deal, upend the entire Batman mythology, and they're like, no, we don't want to we don't want to do that. And I'm like, all right, fair enough. So I just write all these down, I write them all down, and it's like you can just take those ideas and scrape off the serial numbers, and now you got your own story. It's not that hard to make a Superman-like character who's nothing like Superman in terms of how he looks and acts, but like it basically serves the same purpose to the story. And so yeah, so it's basically like all my rejected DC pitches in one kid's, a graphic novel about a superhero or about a superhero who loses his memory.
Awesome.
And his Jimmy Olsen like friend who helps him.
That's awesome. Can't wait to read it. Maybe we can talk about it when it's closer to
That'd be
coming
great.
out.
It'd be really great.
Here's my very last question. Um, where's Charles Barkley in all this?
I know. Well, okay, so here's the thing. I did do a reference to Charles Barkley in Kaijumax, where somebody says that like, oh yeah, when this character was in Tokyo, like he put on some sunglasses and he like slam dunked on some guy, and so anyway, that was a reference to the Charles Barkley Nike ad from the '90s, where Charles Barkley and Godzilla played basketball, and of course, it is non-canonical to Kaijumax. Somebody just made that, but But anyway, and the funny thing is, I actually met Charles Barkley years ago because our family is friends with Dikembe Mutombo,
Wait,
who
what?
is yeah. So Dikembe Mutombo's cousin from the uh, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which was called Zaire at the time. He had fled from the thing. So anyway, his cousin and his family lived in Cleveland when we lived in Cleveland. So we were good friends with them. And then we moved to Denver. And so we got a call from Louis Kanda who said, "Oh, hey, my cousin Dikembe Mutombo is just been recruited by the Denver Nuggets. Would you please make him feel at home in Denver?" And so we would invite him over to dinner. And if, in case you don't know, Dikembe Mutombo is 7'2", and so he comes over, yeah, and his fingers that he wags are about 9 inches long, and anyway, he's a delightful person, and so he comes over, and he walks in and he has a hat on, and he puts it on like the post on like the first landing of our stairs instead of like the one that we can all reach. Like he puts it way up there. Um, yeah, and I mean, he and his brother his we said, "Oh, your brothers live in town. What are they tall like you?" They're like, "Ah, no, they're short, 6'10" and 6'9" or whatever. So so anyway, we would go to a lot of Nuggets games because he was like, "Yeah, I'll get you some seats right behind the basketball net, like where all the families sit." And so we would go, and then he's like, "Yeah, we were gonna get some dinner. We were playing the 76ers." And so Charles Barkley was playing for them at that time. And so we went to dinner in Denver with Dikembe and Charles Barkley. And I think no, I was gonna say Manute Bol was there, but Manute Bol was in the game, but he didn't come to dinner. But Manute Bol was even taller than Dikembe. He was something like 7'10". But
What is Charles Barkley like in person?
funny, friendly, a little rude, like in a funny way, right? Like my dad is bald, and so my dad was sort of saying like, like somebody was talking about shaving your head, and he's like, "Yeah, if I didn't shave my head, I'd look like this guy," he said to my dad. And which is funny. My dad's like, "Yeah, I've been bald for 30 years. I don't care." But anyway, yeah, he's nice. Yeah, he was really friendly. I mean, who knows like what people are like other than when they're just like, I don't remember who won that game, but I mean everybody was in good spirits. So
Is Charles Barkley on TV? And Charles Barkley the person that you hung out with? Like how close are we seeing?
oh well, pretty close. Yeah, pretty close. I mean, just a smart aleck, and I mean, I only talked to him a little bit. I was 18 years old or whatever. So
It's
uh
insanely cool.
yeah, I know it was pretty cool. And yeah, I mean, uh yeah, I mean, it was we were so lucky to be able to do that. uh
It is by far the coolest story anyone has ever said on my show. I'm a huge
yeah,
basketball fan, so I'm like, oh my God, that is
yeah,
awesome.
yeah. So yeah, so it was really cool that um well, and then Dikembe was only a couple of years older than I am. He retired whatever 10 years ago, and just started spending all his money to make hospitals in the Congo. Like,
Yeah,
yeah, I just think that's fantastic.
yeah.
Anyway, because he wanted to be a doctor, but when you're 7'2" and your whole family is like, "You are going to be a basketball player," then that's what you have to do.
when
So
you're 7'2" and your whole family is probably like, you are way out of here.
yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, like I don't know what their situation was, and because when he left, I believe it was, I don't think it was the Congo. Yeah, I think it was still Zaire. I mean, I think that the political situation was not great, um, and so uh, yeah, I'm sure that was part of it. They're
So
like, "You're going to go to you speak like 7 languages, none of which are English, so you're going to go to America and be a basketball player."
well, it is a God-given gift.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, somebody made him tall. It wasn't any people.
Thank you so much, Xander. This was great. This was such a
Yeah.
great conversation.
It's
And
always so much fun.
Kaijumax, congratulations on it being
Oh,
done.
thanks. Well,
Yeah,
and I'll have to send you some pages of my new stuff. I hope you enjoy them. I think
it's
it'd be
awesome.
pretty fun.
Thank you. I'll
Yeah.
look forward to it.
Okay.
Thanks, Xander.